Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Competitive Conversations. Thank you for joining us. We hope you've enjoyed the past few episodes. Got a lot more coming out, a lot more shows that we've been alluding to as well. We're recording those very soon. But today, hopefully, the title has hooked you in and you're dying to hear about what we have to say. But today, we're talking about hypertrophy and its role in CrossFit, functional fitness. Could probably even apply to high rocks or anything in that kind of realm. They could really apply to anything, but in context, we'll probably be talking mostly about CrossFit. So yeah, people. I think most people think they have an idea of what hypertrophy is, and even if they do, there's still a lot to think about. It's not just some simple thing that you could just say like I'm doing X, I'm doing hypertrophy or I need to, especially in the sport of CrossFit where there's a lot of performance tied to it. It's all performance based, so not just looks or just strength alone. So yeah, we're going to get into that. Sam's got some really cool stuff to talk about in terms of how to most efficiently train it, maybe some considerations for you, because a lot of people probably do need this, but too much could be detrimental. You could do it at the wrong time. Some people might not need it at all, really. So yeah, we're going to get into all of that. Any opening thoughts, Sam?
Yeah, I guess maybe a short little intro on hypertrophy CrossFit. So, of course, hypertrophy, which we'll talk about definitions, has been around for a long time with kind of the advent of bodybuilding and the move towards aesthetics and growing the body, the shape, etc. And then when CrossFit came on the scene, the intention was towards fitness, work capacity against broad time modal domains. And so hypertrophy kind of gets seated in there, but it's not let's say, a main priority of the methodology that is CrossFit. But there is applicability with growing your muscles and your structure to support the expression of work capacity inside the context of CrossFit. However, it's not just slapping bodybuilding on top of CrossFit and now you got this like perfect plan. There's intricacies to how we're going to go about that, especially if we're thinking about CrossFit in the context of performing or competing in CrossFit. Because if it's just for health purposes or fitness in general purposes, there might be a little bit more wiggle room with some of the things we'll talk about. But if we're focusing in on those that want to compete, then there are some harder borders that we'd want to stick to ensure that whatever we are doing in the gym is influencing performance. Because at the end of the day, the most important variable in the equation for a competitor inside of sport is performance. So whatever we're doing, if it's not moving the performance needle, then we have to question whether or not it's helpful. So implementing hypertrophy specific work, we have to question, is this going to translate to performance improvements? And if it is, great. If it's not, or we're unsure, then we need to reassess the approach we're taking. So I had a few initial thoughts before we get into some definitions and some context for people. So the first one I thought about was the SAID principle, so specific adaptations to impose demands. So if we put stress on our body in a particular way, we're going to get adaptations as a result of it. And this is something that you are trying to do with hypertrophy-specific trainings. You're trying to drive specific adaptations with respect to the muscle getting bigger in most cases. But again, we got to loop it back to performance. Is that change in the muscle going to drive performance improvements? And we have to assess that. Predisposition. So this is interesting. Some people, like I'll use myself as an example. My quads have always been, I'd say, fairly good size. They have like good separation and like structure ever since I've been young. So like if I do any mild amount of squatting or leg press or leg extensions, like my legs get pretty big. Like they're just one body part that really responds to training. And certain people are predisposed to certain muscle groups that will just respond really well. So you could do a really minimal amount of training and all of a sudden those muscles are getting stronger and bigger. Again, though, does that mean it's translated performance? We have to assess that, because just because my quads are getting bigger doesn't necessarily mean my thruster capabilities or my pistol capabilities are going to improve. If anything, maybe it gets worse. Who knows? Something we have to look into. So it can be a good or a bad thing if you have a predisposition for growth in a certain area. And then another initial thought was performance over form. So again, if we're anchoring the conversation on competitive CrossFit, then we always have to come back to performance. Everything we're doing's got to move the needle of performance. Otherwise, we're wasting time and resources, arguably. And then the fourth last initial thought is like what we want, at least in our head. What are we thinking about when we think about hypertrophy in the context of competitive CrossFit? We want quote unquote functional lean mass, which the Goldilocks idea is prevalent here, which is not too much, not too little. Like, we want the lean mass that we accumulate to be functional towards the performance demands we have. So we don't want, which we'll get into this, we don't want an excessive amount, and we don't want a lack thereof. We want like enough that we can support and utilize given the performance demands we have. So those are some initial thoughts on hypertrophy and CrossFit that I thought might be nice to start out with.
Yeah. And thinking of some of the things you said, like people just, slapping in bodybuilding into CrossFit into their program. And really most people, their idea of adding the bodybuilding is develop the muscle, likely hypertrophy. And they kind of think, a lot of people are thinking, if I'm doing a bodybuilding movement or a bodybuilding split or something that I've seen bodybuilders do, that they are going to improve hypertrophy, which most people, I guess, most people who are educated or understand it know that's not true. And that could be a huge miss for people, where they might be doing something like muscle endurance work, or they might just be fatiguing like crazy. And it's, almost a waste of time. And then other people are probably seeing a lot of these athletes and a lot of hyper responders, like you mentioned, and thinking like, Chandler Smith, Noah Olson, just some people that come to mind that just, are going to have crazy physiques for a long time. And they've had crazy physiques before CrossFit. And they're like, I need to look like that in order to be better, which is they have the predisposition to it, which they probably already also have a predisposition to being able to fuel those muscles extremely well and recover really quick and maintain good range of motion. Thinking of Noah specifically, like, he could be at his most jacked and probably still do, an L sit to press to handstand on parallettes. So you can't just look at those people and be like, all right, well, I need more hypertrophy because I'm way smaller than this person. You need a really good reason to want to get or need the hypertrophy. And then you have to do that, in a way that's not going to hinder your performance, like you said, because the ultimate goal is, are we getting better? Because I imagine there's a lot of people that improve from the hypertrophy work or the CrossFit work, but it's likely not for all of them, just that they're getting, increased muscle size. It could just be they're resting more or they're doing less intense work. But there are probably some people too that are like, I did a little bit of bodybuilding style work and it was really good hypertrophy work for, maybe they did it for, 6 to 8 weeks in the off season. Their muscles developed better, then their strength was better. They recovered more, it kind of led into a really good base for them. So hopefully from what we're getting into next, people will probably have a better idea or a better aim what to look for or what to try and do.
Yeah. And that's a really good, you brought a couple good points there that I was going to bring up later, but maybe we'll just bring it up now. The one point being, which you'll see this often, people who've been pushing really hard or training really hard, and they've reached a pretty high level and they're pretty competitive, but they're now slightly burnt out, whether or not they recognize it. And they start to gravitate towards slower contractions, more, let's say, bodybuilding in principle, or functional bodybuilding even, which is exactly how that came about, because Marcus, as a great example, was training and competing in the games. He also was doing grid and he was really burnt out. His body hurt, his joints ached. And so the coaches that were helping him at the time, they came up with a plan for let's get you slowing down, a little less intensity, moving through full ranges, challenging some positions, but with just a lot less stress on the system, let's say systemically and more peripherally. And that was kind of the genesis of functional bodybuilding. And what did it do? It allowed him to relax, recover, get back to like a homeostasis where his body and just mental state and everything felt really good. And that I created a great springboard for his subsequent season where he had a great competitive season. But it's important to note that he had probably at that point, I don't know, maybe 10 years of training already under his belt. He'd been to the games multiple times. Like he was already elite, but his system needed a break because it was pushed so hard. And so the great alternative was just to slow things down, which functional bodybuilding is much slower and controlled in a general sense. There are, of course, things that are more challenging and faster. And I've seen that with other games athletes. And I think people can be quick to assume, oh, I need this then because it worked for that person. It's like, well, you need context. You can't be so myopic and zoomed in. It's like you zoom out and you look at the bigger picture. Oh, okay, they were burnt out. They gravitate to this. Now they feel better. They're recovered. Their performance is better, even though they haven't been doing Metcon. It's like, well, yeah, because your system needed a break. So that's really important because tools serve a purpose, but we always have to look in the grand scheme of things to figure out how that tool is serving us on our pursuit towards getting better, and not all of a sudden turn it into like the holy grail that we were missing all along. Because that's what I think some people can fall victim to, is thinking that way. The other thing you mentioned, which is a really good point about Chandler and Noah, more so Chandler, because Chandler is extremely jacked and just like shredded. I mean, he could do a natural bodybuilder show tomorrow and probably podium. May win. Now, the thing is, on the male and the female side, the biggest, most jacked person doesn't win the games. Jeff Adler's pretty jacked, but he's not the biggest. Matt Frazier was thick, but he was not the most jacked. Rich Froning was not the most jacked, but he was lean. If you just go back, Tia is small but jacked. She's not the biggest. Who won before Tia? I don't even remember. Katrin Davidsdottir, she was small but really lean. There's a trade-off. When you have a lot of lean mass, that's really costly. That's an expensive unit of energy. So you have to be fueling that. So if you have a lot of it, it's a lot of oxygen you have to bring in. And if you're challenging your whole body in a piece of work for 10 to 15 minutes, that's a ton of energy ton of oxygen you have to bring in to supply that tissue the resources it needs to keep working at a high rate. So you look at the games champions, you look at most of the people in the top 5, 10, they're fit and they're lean, like they're ripped, but they don't look like Chandler Smith. Like, yes, Chandler's been in the top 10. Like he's obviously an amazing athlete. He's accomplished a lot in sport. But I'm saying you look at Justin Medeiros, even Pat Vellner, Brent Fikowski, which Brent's gotten bigger over the years. He might be a little bit of an anomaly. Cole Sager. These guys aren't overly jacked because that's not advantageous for the sport. So there's a balance between Travis Mayer is a great example. There's a balance between enough lean mass to support your structure, support your joint health, support the contraction volumes you need to do, support the amount of load you have to bear on, but not too much to where it actually starts to hinder you. And same on the women's side. So that's really important. I think people sometimes forget that. And I have an analogy we'll talk about later that sheds a little bit of light on that. But yeah, those are just two good things that I figured we might as well hit on since you mentioned them.
Yeah. Okay. So let's get into what is hypertrophy for those who don't know, or for those who maybe just have a general understanding, maybe not, maybe they never studied it or really understood, or they're just like, they think it just, it's growth. I'm going to get bigger. But let's dive into, a little bit deeper.
I'll let you read it.
All right. So Sam's got a little note, he's got a little note for us here. All right. What is hypertrophy? You guys might want to slow this down or pause and be ready. The enlargement of an organ or tissue due to the increase in the size of its cells, In the context of muscle tissue, hypertrophy refers to the growth of muscle cells leading to an increase in muscle mass and overall muscle size. So increasing the muscle cell within the muscle.
Yeah. Or an organ, which is interesting because with elite endurance athletes, you see the heart growth, the left ventricular hypertrophy, which is an adaptation of endurance training because it allows you to push more blood into circulation. So you actually see adaptation of an organ. And then in some cases with disease, you'll see overgrowth of an organ that's actually something you don't want. So that definition where it says, or steroids, which, unfortunately sometimes can not only grow your muscles, but it grows other organs that you do not want to be growing, and that leads to problems. Hypertrophy is let's say a general term for growth or the increase of the size of the cells inside of the body. But we're going to, of course, hone in on muscles specifically because that's what we care about.
We got a little graphic for you, those who are watching. So if you look at
part
this would be
the next part to talk about.
So if you look at part A, and then you look at across the line. So we have this, just think of this as like a muscle fiber, and you have all these little, we'll just keep it simple. We got these cells, you got strings. The strings have just grown. So now it's bigger onto the right side over here versus the other term, hyperplasia, which some people might even think this is what's happening in hypertrophy, which is you're increasing the total number of cells, which is so far impossible for training without the use of drugs or without, I think the only study they've seen in an animal where they've had hyperplasia in like a grown adult, which it wasn't an adult, it was a rat. And they basically tortured the rat and hung them up by their legs for, it was like days or something. And it was like in the most severe cases where they kept the rat alive and there was some form of hyperplasia. So I don't think you're going to be able to replicate that unless you're just going to absolutely torture yourself, and who knows the repercussions of that.
I don't think
we do know that.
To my knowledge, the hyperplasia is that's possible in humans, like you just said. There's the two types of hypertrophy are myofibrillar and sarcoplasmic, which to my knowledge, that's as of what I looked at this past week. An easy way to think of this is think of a weightlifter who weighs 185 pounds and back squats 600 pounds, as opposed to a bodybuilder who's 250 pounds, 10% body fat, super jacked, and he also back squats 600 pounds. Some people will go, how on earth can that 185 pound guy squat that much? Part of it is a neuromuscular component, but also part of it is the myofibrillar hypertrophy, where they have strong, more dense musculature as a result of the training adaptations. So there's density in the muscle, but there's not necessarily size. And this is something you see, like Travis Mir being an example, where Travis is actually really strong comparative to his competitors, like his back squat, his deadlift. Like he's got some really great strength numbers, but he's not like Chandler. He doesn't look like this transformer character, but he's very strong. He's got a lot of great myofibrillar hypertrophy, in my opinion. Whereas sarcoplasmic hypertrophy is something you'll see with bodybuilders, where their muscles are just so big, and what you're seeing the volume inside the sarcoplasm increasing. So the fluid and non-contractile components within the muscle cell are getting bigger. So there's volume inside the cell, and so then it gives you the visual appearance that you're really big. But that doesn't necessarily translate to, let's say, absolute strength adaptations. Because the easy example would be weightlifters. Weightlifters, or even pound for pound power lifters, who some of the 180, 190 pound guys are squatting maybe 700, 800 pounds. What was that one guy who's I think he squatted 1,000 pounds. He was right around 200 pounds of body weight, something like that. He's like the natty undisputed champion, or I forget his name. But the point being, size doesn't necessarily equal strength. So there are two different types of hypertrophy, and then the type of training we do is going to dictate what type of adaptations we are going to get. Because if you look at a traditional bodybuilding approach to training, which for the most part you could say is training to failure, whether it's heavy or it's light, you're going to drive more of the sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. Whereas if you're training strength or strength density, and maybe less training to failure, there could be more of an adaptation to this myofibular hypertrophy. So those are, let's say, the two main overarching types of hypertrophy, and the type of athlete / adaptations you're going to get as a byproduct of the type of training that sits inside of those buckets.
Good deal. Yeah. Which you can get there almost the same way, but like and that's where kind of we were having the sarcoplasmic versus the myofibular. That's where I was kind of going back to where people might be doing something where it might deter their gains, like you said, like the bodybuilder, like the size just increases without strength, which maybe sometimes you do need to increase size. Obviously you need to increase the strength as well, but like you said, like a bigger quad might not be advantageous for someone, or a bigger chest, or bigger traps. And that's like the big difference in what you had discussed, the difference between the weightlifter and the bodybuilder, because which weightlifting, the best weightlifter isn't going to win the games either, or perform really well in CrossFit, but that's still the trend there. It's a performance-based trend, and that's more so what we're looking for.
Yeah. And the biggest muscle is not going to be the strongest muscle. I mean, I remember in college, this 400-meter sprinter, he ended up going to the Olympics. He won a silver medal, but this was a few years before he went. And he's a 400-meter sprinter, but he had like these really slender quads. Like his legs were small, but he was pretty jacked, but he wasn't that big. And I watched him back squat 450. He probably could have done it for a double. And he probably weighed 175 pounds, 180 pounds. And I mean, he did like 2.5 times his body weight for a pretty fast single below parallel. It didn't look the best, but there's an element of that myofibular hypertrophy, but there's also, which I'm looping something else in, like his system's ability to leverage his fascia and a stretch reflex and the coordination of his motor units firing. So there's other things there, but the point just being that just because you got the biggest quads doesn't mean you're going to have the biggest squat. Do they help? Of course they help, but just wanted to highlight that size doesn't always equal strength. There are lots of examples of people who aren't necessarily big, but they are very, very strong from a different type of adaptation that's happening under the hood.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that kind of leads into you have the mechanisms of hypertrophy. How do we induce hypertrophy? Which we're going to get into rep ranges and stuff later, but classically, and even in the textbooks now, which they're changing for the better, it's getting a little bit better, but overall, you go to school or you're going through some education system, and they're like, it's all by rep ranges. And that's what it says. If you want to do hypertrophy, it's most of the time it's going to say like between 8 and 20 reps, or like 5 and 30, which you can achieve that there. But, that's like, it's almost like saying, well, you can only get strong, or the best way to get strong is through 1 and 5. Well, while that could be true, or, that could be generally one of the best ways, that doesn't mean you're doing hypertrophy work, or that you are doing it optimally just by staying within that rep range. You have to kind of understand what you're trying to do and get out of it. And then you could understand probably a little better how to induce the hypertrophy.
Well, there's research more recently that showed that you could drive the same adaptations from a hypertrophy standpoint with 3 or 5s as you could with 20 or 25 reps. Just the key being like you have to get occlusion, you have to go to failure to create the adaptation you really want. So yeah, the more cookie cutter approach to a particular type of response is not as strong as it once was in exercise physiology.
And it could be movement dependent. If you had a tempo,
Mm-hmm.
like there's a huge, if you're let's just say you're doing 10 reps and this is your hypertrophy set. If you do that 10 reps at 4.0 XO, it's a lot different than doing it at 1.0 XO, which would be, a 4 second versus a 1 second lowering of the
Mm-hmm.
movement. So it's definitely more intricate than that. And that's where probably
Yeah.
people fail. That's probably the biggest like step where people aren't understanding, or they're just saying I'm doing hypertrophy because they believe they
Yeah.
are, which some of them might be doing it if they just maybe
Yeah.
naturally do it correctly.
Yeah. Well, as a nice segue, I mean, I think most people aren't really doing it because it's actually really uncomfortable and really tough because
Mhm.
you have to really like it's really I remember this a few times myself and then with other clients where you spend a lot of time training for CrossFit, you compete, and ironically with CrossFit, you're not trying to get a huge pump, you're not trying to get really swole, you're trying to get blood in and out of your muscles really efficiently so you can keep working, because if you're occluding or you're too pumped, you actually have to stop because your muscles, you're not going to be able to get blood in and out effectively, so you can keep working. You actually have to stop, and we don't want that. You want to keep working. So you go through this long period of time where you're training with that intention, and then let's say you take 2 months to train quote unquote hypertrophy, and now you're actually trying to create this occlusion and a lot of pain, a lot of exercise induced pain, and it's really uncomfortable because it's not something you're used to. Like doing a drop set of bicep curls, it's so painful, but you just aren't used to that, and some people like stray away from it a little bit because they're just not, their brain and body's just not used to that. Whereas a bodybuilder, it's just their bread and butter. It's what they do on a Tuesday. So so I think a lot of people don't do true hypertrophy training because it's a lot more challenging than you would think, because people just don't push themselves in that format that much. But we can kind of get there. We can get there with some of the training variables we can use and try to get people closer to it. But I think for a lot of people listening to us inside the CrossFit space, I don't think they're really doing true hypertrophy work. And I would argue that you wouldn't want to do it anyways. Like which I kind of talked about earlier. Like you're not trying to train like a bodybuilder. You're trying to train for performance, which is going to ask you to train in a particular way. So I think it's okay that some people just aren't really going for it the way you need to actually create the gains you need. There's more productive ways, but I don't want to get too far off course. So mechanisms of hypertrophy. So the two primary mechanisms: mechanical tension generated by lifting heavy weights, places stress on the muscle fibers, and then metabolic stress. So high repetitions, moderate weights create a metabolic stress that can drive these adaptations as well. So we need tension. Tension is extremely important. And then usually as a byproduct of that tension, we get the metabolic stress, which triggers these adaptations that we need. So from a training variables perspective, I have 4 here that we can leverage, which these are just great training variables for program design in general. Like these should be things you're thinking about all the time when you're writing training. The first one, progressive overload, which is the principal foundation for training, but also for muscle growth. Like you got to do a little bit more than you did the previous time. Otherwise, you're not going to stimulate growth. And then you can do that through a myriad of ways, whether it's weight, volume, or intensity, to continue challenging the muscle or the pattern. Training volume. So usually there's definitely some debate here. I'd have to look up what Lyle McDonald says because he's my go-to guy for anything hypertrophy or bodybuilding, because he's shunned by all of the mainstream people, which tells me he's probably the guy with the best answers. And I just love his attitude. He's like so cocky and makes fun of people, and he's pretty funny. If you don't follow him on Instagram, he's loud. Look him up. He's
unbothered.
Yeah, he's great. But usually you do need a lot of volume in the week. So the note I had was upwards of 20, 25 sets per muscle group, which is a lot. So especially if you look at, like, even if I look at what I write for clients who are training to get stronger or put on lean mass, like maybe some of them are close to that, but not many, because there's it doesn't. How do I want to word this? It's hard to weave that in with other things you're trying to do when you're trying to train concurrently. It's just, you're trying to weigh a lot of different things, or let's say you're trying to balance a lot of different things, and so you have to be cognizant of the energy. If you're doing 20 really hard sets of pulling, that's going to influence a lot of things you're doing with your training. So again, it comes back to time. Yeah, that's the other. Thank you. Yeah, that's the big variable too. Like 20 quality sets, that's a lot of time. It's a lot of time. Then the third one is intensity. So intensity is extremely important. Like yes, as referencing relative to your maximum, but I would also say intensity in the sense of your intention. Like you have to really want to grow. Like if you don't really want to grow, or you don't really want to be uncomfortable, then you're not going to be driving those adaptations you want. Like you can't just half-ass your sets of 12 bicep curls. Like you got to really go for it. Otherwise, you're not gonna make anything meaningful happen. So intensity is really important. Just type in full stop. Just type in Dorian Yates training. Spend an hour on YouTube. Watch him train. One of the best bodybuilders of all time. Probably trained the most intensely of anyone. And it's the reason why he's one of the best. And he'll show you some true intensity. And he'll probably make you get a little uncomfortable and cry, because he's just a savage, big man training hard in the basement. But it should motivate you. That's the intensity you need if you really want to make gains. And then repetition range, which I add in a note, both lower and higher repetition ranges can also contribute to muscle growth when combined with appropriate volume intensity. So traditionally 6 to 12 reps, they said, drives hypertrophy, but that research isn't supported as strongly as it once was. So intensity, intention are bigger drivers nowadays of this adaptation we're going after.
Yeah. And the intention.
Yeah, the intention.
There is no hypertrophy without intention, because like you said, if you don't want it, it's not going to happen. And really, because if you don't want it, you're not going to perform it intensely enough. You're like, if you're just thinking of you're doing bicep curls, and let's just say you're doing 4 sets of 12 reps, and you have 90-second rest, or even if you have a 3-minute rest. But if you are really if you're really pushing it, like the last few reps have to be close to failure. Not failure like I just can't do another. It's like you're holding 20 pounds or 25 pounds. It's light. You're having, like great contractions in the bicep. It's really hurting. And you're like, I don't know if I could repeat that. And then 90 seconds later, you got to go repeat that. And that's a big reason why there's a rep range. A lot of the times, like, hey, maybe your coach or whatever you're following is like, this is 10 to 12 reps, because likely you won't, if you're doing it really well, you might not be able to repeat the 12th rep on the second set and the third and the fourth. But you're still getting the same stimulus.
Yep. And that's also why most people who really want to drive hypertrophy and get bigger, you want a training partner. Like you need somebody to spot you or help you with some forced reps. Like I had one of my good friends through high school, when we would train, like we would spot each other. And that was really important, because like you need to get to the point on some sets where you need somebody like there helping you a little bit. Like that's the level of fatigue you're trying to get to really drive this hypertrophy. So, Lyle McDonald, he has like this ongoing beef with Mike Israetel, because Mike at times would say he trains really hard, and then Lyle would create a video of watching him do a set, and he doesn't really go to failure until Lyle would hate on him, because he's like, if you really want gains, you have to go to failure, and you don't train that hard. And so you can find it on YouTube. It's pretty funny. It's Lyle's like, you gotta go for it. Anyways, getting back on track, I had a note around muscle endurance versus true hypertrophy. So that's actually something that's super interesting, because in CrossFit, let's say there's a category of training or testing we could call muscle endurance. And to give you an example, what that would look like, say you had to do 50 chest to bar 50 box jump overs, 50 snatches, light, 50 burpees, 50 GHD sit-ups, 50 thrusters, or something like that, where in a workout like that, muscle endurance is really being challenged with all of those contraction types. And so that's very different than like doing a drop set of bicep curls, because in the former example, you're trying to control fatigue and not get to the point where you're fully blown up where you can't keep working. Like you're trying to perform some work, take a break, recover a little bit, like within 3 seconds, do some more work, recover, do some more. And you're trying to get better and better at that, where your rest periods are getting shorter and shorter. And that's what separates the best from the rest, is their rest periods are very, very, very short. It almost looks like there isn't any rest. Whereas in the hypertrophy, like you're not trying to rest. You're just trying to keep going and going and going and going. And then you get to this point of failure where your muscles just cannot work anymore. And then you rest. And then you recuperate, you do it again. So that's one easy example of how different true hypertrophy training is from, let's say, muscle endurance. And the intention is very different, to your point a moment ago. Like you're not trying to you're trying to chase performance in the former example. Like I'm trying to get through all this as fast as I can. Whereas in the latter example, I'm trying to make my bicep grow bigger. So that's an important distinction, because the former example is going to require training to work on that. And hypertrophy training in the traditional sense, if you were to try to do it in tandem, that could act in opposition, because you're actually trying to make the bicep inside of the performance realm not occlude so quickly. Like I'm trying to make it last longer. So I'm going to do things in training that are going to try to help influence that. Whereas if I want it to grow, then I want it to occlude and reach failure and drive a lot of stress to that muscle. So it's just an important thing to think about when we think about hypertrophy, muscle endurance, and how those aims are a little bit different when we're thinking about performance inside of CrossFit.
Yeah. And circling back to where we were talking about, this could be detrimental, is you're doing too much of the hypertrophy. You're getting too much occlusion. You're so tight. You're getting a lot more tension. Your muscles might be growing too much, and you might some people may not, if they're lucky, become less enduring. And then if they do that at the wrong time, say like right before quarterfinals or the Open, if it mattered at the time to them, or in relation to the sport, then they're training to do that kind of, Louis' thing was like, train slow, you'll be slow. Like you have to train fast, you have to train heavy. Like, I don't think that's like a hill to die on, but in this sense, like if you're training all the time to occlude and get tight, you're likely going to see that within, like the 50 burpee box jump overs. Like you got tight, you got blown up because you're essentially doing a hypertrophy set because you're going so fast, or you don't know how to pace, or your muscles just don't know how to recover fast enough. Like you said, the best recover, between the reps.
Yeah. The muscles haven't been trained effectively. Like that's why this is so important. Hopefully I've mentioned it enough, but we got to mention it more, is you got to come back to performance and what outcomes is performance asking for. It's not asking for bigger biceps. It's asking for completing 13 legless rope climbs faster. Like you're 50 burpee box jump overs, you're trying to complete that faster with less fatigue accumulates. You can go do wall balls or go do running or whatever you got to do in addition to it. So that's really important, because if you train your muscle to reach failure or occlude, and again, especially if the timing's wrong, that can be very detrimental to performance. So context is important. Time of year is important. Figuring out, is this something I need to be investing time into? Because I don't want to come off as though I think hypertrophy is a bad thing inside of performance. It plays a role. It's just important to understand the role it does play and how it sits in the overall framework of training to get better at the sport. So again, the goal in this conversation is I want performance to improve. So what do I need to be doing to improve my performance? Do I actually need to get bigger? Do I need to get stronger? Or do I need to be more enduring? So these are things we got to come back to to just help anchor our decision-making process. So I think that acts as a good segue for some more specific to CrossFit and hypertrophy. Like, why do we need it? How does it serve us? So obviously having more muscle is a good thing to a point. There's a point of diminishing returns. It's going to help with joint health. It's going to help with taking on all the load that we need. It's going to help with, of course, putting out power. It's going to help with our metabolic system, like our ability to clear glucose and use it as a fuel, glycogen. Really, like, there's a lot of benefits to muscle. That's why it's very important for all humans. But there's a balance, because if you have too much lean mass, now again, you're going to go through your gasoline more quickly, for lack of a better analogy. Like, you're burning fuel really too quickly, and that's not helpful. Like, we want to be, like the Energizer Bunny, just keep going. So an analogy I came up with maybe a few years ago that's helpful for thinking about the development of your body. And this is something I speak with a lot of my younger clients with when they are trying to get bigger, because of their frame just needs to grow. And you're actually a good example too, because when we started 6 years ago, you were smaller and less built, but you were strong and you had good speed and mechanics. Like, your lifts were good, but your frame just needed to get a lot bigger.
Yeah. That's one of the first things you told me. You were like, we got to grow the torso right now.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's grown a lot. I mean, you look at 6 years, like, your body's way different now. Like, your traps, your shoulders, your back, like your arms, everything's like way more robust. Of course, as a byproduct of training, but that was a very gradual process, because now, to my analogy, you can't put a Ferrari engine in the body of a Prius car. Prius is like a hybrid car, and then of course everybody knows what a Ferrari is, and vice versa. You're not going to put a Prius engine in a Ferrari, because the engine is not going to match the chassis. The chassis and the engine need to be in concert with each other. And so it's the same with our bodies. Like, our skeletal frame needs to be representative of what our metabolic system can handle. So if I go extremely hard on gaining a lot of lean mass, and I build a lot of lean mass, my metabolic system is going to lag behind, and it's going to have to catch up to powering all that extra lean mass I put on. So when you add a lot of lean mass really quickly, that's not actually that helpful, because now you're going to have a lag with matching your chassis to your engine. So ideally, inside of a sport like CrossFit, you want the gains to be very incremental and controlled, so that the chassis and engine stay tightly connected as you're growing. And I've seen this in my own training, and also with a couple of my clients, where we did it the wrong way and we've done it the right way, and you just see the difference. You can listen to their responses with training. You can see how slow they move, how slow they recover. And then they're all of a sudden, like, 6 months later, there's this point where they start feeling fitter, they're improving their speed, their recoverability. But if you look at the train hasn't changed too much, but we've started to move away from this intention of putting on lean mass or adjusting macros or their nutritional profile to drive that adaptation, because it's not serving anymore. And so now when I talk to clients who do need to get bigger, it's making them realize, like, okay, yeah, I want to get bigger, but it's got to be real incremental and slow. And that's going to allow me to maintain this good relationship between my chassis and my engine as I'm moving forward. So inside of CrossFit, where there aren't body weight categories, that's really important, because weighing an extra 5-10 pounds might not be beneficial. Like, the average weight's changed a little bit over recent years. It's gotten a little bit heavier for men and women, but not by a huge amount. So you still need to be in this 195, 200 pound for men, and 145, 150-ish range for women, around there off the top of my head.
Yeah.
So,
and even the heavier athletes are still, performing really well in the areas where, like, they're still really good at body weight. They're still really good at running.
Yeah, but they're just going to lose, because they have to do so much more work, and they don't get credit for all the extra work they actually have to do because they're moving more load through over the course of the task. So
Yeah.
weighing 5 pounds less with muscle ups, deadlifts, handstand walking, that makes a huge difference. That can be a lot. 5 less pounds of lean
Yeah.
mass.
And the car analogy, kind of similar to how you said in the, when you opened up with the podcast, like you respond pretty well with your legs. So let's just say I'm trying to grow my quads. They get a lot bigger. And let's just say like we gain 3 inches on your quads in, 2 months. That's probably not great and it probably won't translate to better running, recovering better in
Definitely
between
not.
thrusters, your pistols, because
Yeah.
there's just more muscle to fuel. Just think of like your blood, like you
Yeah.
said, the gasoline, or,
Yeah.
it has to bring it out further now. It has, it's
Yeah.
denser. It's going to be
Yeah.
harder.
Heavier.
Heavier. So you're actually moving more load overall. So you can't just equate, again, another thing we said earlier is like the biggest and the most jacked aren't always the best.
No.
And I think of the Panchicks as kind of a good example of this, because they're
Mm-hmm.
very strong, but very lean and on the lighter side. Like they
Yeah.
look huge, but like, they're probably between, 180 to 190 pounds.
Yeah.
And,
About that.
like they're lean, they're slender, very strong, but like they're great runners. They're great at gymnastics. Excuse me. So, if you were to be like, oh, hey, let's just take Saxon. Like Saxon, if this were true, like the past 3 strength events, you were, 15th to 20th. Like we just need to get you bigger. The amount he would probably suffer by just getting bigger in the other areas would be such a big trade-off. It wouldn't be worth it, where he needs to find a way, if this were true, just to get stronger and improve maybe by a little bit in those tests without gaining a ton of size. Cause when the amount of areas that you need to be good at with relative body weight is nowhere near close to the amount of, tests you need to be just bigger and stronger at.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. And that's why I always find it interesting when people, like there was a picture of Justin Medeiros when he won, and they're like, "This guy's the fittest on earth." Like, look at him, and it's like, yeah, he is. Look at his body. Like you want to look like that, because there's a benefit if the tests were challenging. The tests are going to reveal who is the most properly set up to perform those tests at that time. And if you look, like on the average, you're going to see somebody who's a little less jacked, a little bit, let's say, leaner, for lack of a better term. Leaner as in like not like bulky and like big, boulder shoulders and biceps, stuff like that, because that's really advantageous. And so, even somebody like Saxon, definitely not. He probably doesn't need to get any bigger. It's probably just refining some things, or just little subtle guys at that level, top 20 in the world. It's like these little things that they can be working on to just make a subtle difference in their performance that adds up over the course of a weekend or the entire week of competition. So, so it's interesting. There's a lot to it. And it's not as simple as I just need to get bigger and stronger and put on size. Like, there's more nuance. We gotta zoom out, look at the big picture, figure out what would be most helpful to improve your performance. Got to come back to performance. That's my fallback of the day. Got to go back to performance.
Yeah, it reminds me of 2 things. One, we're in an endurance sport, because and if you look at other endurance sports, it's not the most jacked. And like you said, a lot of the winners in endurance sports, even if they're not like ultras or something, like they're leaner, but they're not jacked. They're leaner as in they have probably a little less body fat, but they're not 8% or lower. And they don't just have a ton of extra mass, because it just doesn't make sense for them, because they want to be big enough to they want their leg big and strong enough to do the work, and that's as much as they want any bigger, and it's now deterring deterring them from doing better. And why I think people probably have a huge misconception on drugs in the sport, because a lot of drugs, especially anabolics or things that are going to increase muscle extremely quickly or just past where you normally would go is going to be a huge miss on a lot of people. They're like, I need to get stronger, or, I need to recover faster. I'm just going to take drugs. And now they've gained 20 pounds of lean mass, and
Yeah,
it would
good.
be a huge miss. So
Yeah.
if there are drugs in the sport, they're likely not what people are thinking there are at the top level, because it would just be so detrimental. There might be some I don't know. There could be, because there's just no studies on it. There could be maybe some specific people that maybe they just, respond to it really well and don't grow a ton when they get a lot stronger. And I'm sure there's drugs that are better lean towards that. But a lot of the things, the byproducts that are going to come with, you just, doing bodybuilder level drugs or even powerlifting and weightlifting, like, the blood pressure increase, the tension increase. These are all terrible things for CrossFit. And like we said, the more mass, the more, the car you have versus the engine you have. If you gain a lot of that muscle, you might look great, feel great. Your strict handstand push-ups improved on your max set, but can you fuel yourself now for a 20-minute AMRAP that has them?
Yeah, 100%. Well, and also your point around, like, if you gain 20 pounds or something, you're also more likely to tear muscles or strain, because the joints, to my knowledge, like the muscle will change faster than like the joint supportive structures will, and so they won't be ready for the tension the muscle's going to want to go under, and then something goes. So you become more susceptible to that too. So that's another reason why the cohesion between your engine, your chassis is important, because it just sets you up for less susceptibility to potential injuries, because like your chassis and engine are kind of in concert with each other, and they, the amount of strain and load you can take will be supported in kind. Another thing, something I wrote down when you were talking about CrossFit, is an endurance sport. Endurance sport with strong people in it. It's interesting because inside of CrossFit, there is a ceiling for your strength. Like, there's a point where if you got stronger, it probably wouldn't help you or wouldn't improve performance much. Like, if you back squat 600 pounds, it's probably not going to really help you much. If you deadlift 700 pounds, it's probably not going to help you much. If you snatch 400 pounds, probably not. It's kind of like a top end where it's like, you're in this arena, you snatch 300 pounds, you're probably set. Now with work capacity, though, there's like no ceiling. You just keep going. You keep getting better and better and better. And that really tells you a lot about the sport. Like, the strength is supportive and important and is necessary, but there's limits. Whereas work capacity, generally speaking, you can keep making strides there. Like, there's almost no, I guess the point where you would get at, like, there is a ceiling, is getting really fast at a marathon would probably act in opposition to the training you need to do to be good at CrossFit. So there is a top end where you can't just keep extending it out, but you can create more capacity inside of the confines of the sport, and that will drive a lot of performance adaptations that you want. So that is an important caveat, that strength is supportive and necessary, but it's not the big driver of the sport in general. Not to go off on another topic inside of what we were already talking about.
Yeah. When, like you said, the small increase over months and years, it's going to be better for you being able to keep up with the work capacity, increase endurance, increase recovery, because you're not building too much mass too quickly. And then the injury portion, which we didn't really good thing we're kind of touching on it now, because we didn't really talk about it too much. Like, the muscle fiber, your muscles are going to grow a lot faster and increase strength than your tendons and ligaments are, which is kind of what you alluded to with the drugs. Like, the muscle is so strong, but the joint and the supporting tissues around that might not be as strong. And that could possibly happen with the hypertrophy too. Like, you've done a ton of bicep work, your biceps are much stronger, and you did it really fast and you're aggressive. Maybe you were doing the 20 sets a week on the bicep, and then like you're doing legless rope climbs and you tear your bicep, or you're, doing muscle ups and your pec tears, something like that. That's why nothing great comes fast, and you have to, it has to take time, and you have to have the delayed gratification to, just slowly make those gains, be patient. And there's a host of other benefits that are going to come from that as well. And how long you can maintain that, or how little work you need to do to maintain those things, because you've spent so much time doing it really well.
Yeah. Well, yeah, especially that's another fascinating thing is, as you, like for you now, you don't need a lot to maintain the size you have and the lean mass you have. Like you're doing a lot less structured strength training than you did 3 years ago, because you just don't need as much. Like you could do, a couple tough squatting sets in a week. Your legs are going to stay strong. Your squat's going to feel good. So that's the other.
If anything, it's the opposite. It's hard for me to pull away from
that. Yeah. No, 100%. And it would pull away from the things that you, or not pull away, but it takes time away from the things that you would need to be doing to get better on the whole. So there's that trade-off. As you build it over time, then you need a lot less. Lyle McDonald actually talked about that too. As you get more advanced in your training, you need a lot less to maintain whatever you have, or drive it. Well, no, I wouldn't say that. Actually, if you were to drive adaptation with like hypertrophy, I think you'd really have to push the envelope. I'd have to look into that. But again, that's not relevant to our conversation. So maybe wrapping things up, a couple of our two pieces I wrote as like good, let's say, overarching things to close on was, one, always fall back on performance. That's going to be always important. If you lack in a particular area, this is what I wrote out. Let's say pressing, strength, endurance. You will, of course, implement training protocols to help improve that performance. And as a byproduct, you will probably gain some lean mass in your pressing musculature. So that would be how I would think. That would be the frame in my head, which it is with my clients. Okay, their upper body's not strong, so I need to get better in these patterns, like upper pulling or whatever. I'm going to go give them some strength training for that. And as a byproduct, they will probably get stronger and put on some lean mass. But I care about the performance of that movement or pattern. Like I don't care about, I want their biceps to grow a couple inches. Like that's a secondary or a tertiary adaptation that will come. So performance is the center of our decision-making process. And then the second piece being keeping the gains reasonable and consistent. So big changes in structure are not great for metabolic systems. Small incremental increases in lean mass over years. That's really, really important, helpful.
Yeah. I think it's a good wrap up. I think we gave a good little breakdown for people. Hopefully they can take away a little something from it, or maybe just sparked your thought process to think a little bit differently about it, because really almost every kind of area that we're working on has to be extrapolated in something like this, whether it's strength or endurance, or work capacity. They're all going to be a little bit different, but you have to really think, is it improving the performance? Is it sustainable? Am I doing something that I can keep increasing for a long time? Because obviously those are the two main things that matter the most if you're wanting to be successful in this.
Yep. 100%. That's good. I think that's plenty. That was a lot, and I think that was good.
Yep, I agree. Lyle, if you're listening, we'd love to have you on. It's happened once. It's happened once before with someone we look to for a lot of stuff. So maybe he's in there, but
maybe, or he's like, no, you misspoke on those three things. Yeah. They actually are a little bit different, and they're like,
or he's or he's gonna make a video about us talking about it.
Probably not. We don't have enough followers.
No, but it would still help us regardless. So maybe I'll send him an email. You can either roast us or you can come on the show. But all right, everybody, thank you so much for listening. Please comment, like, subscribe. Mainly subscribe. We're trying to boost it up again. I've told you before, we're trying to get back on the live grind. If you have any ideas or comments for us, or thoughts on something you want to hear, we'd love to know. If you're interested in coaching, you can go to proof3.com the bottom right of the screen. Don't click it. That's just a logo. You can go to the description. I got it in there, but you can head over there, set up a free consultation, see if there's something we can do to help you. Or you can just message one of us, and we'd love to help any way we can. So yeah, thanks again for listening. We appreciate your time. We hope you have a great day, and we hope you took a little away from this discussion. And who knows, maybe we'll recap this next year and see if anything's changed. Peace, and have a great day.